women or victims typically don't live their life as if they're going to be a victim, as if they're going to be a plaintiff, as if they're going to be a witness in a lawsuit for themselves. And typically once they become witnesses or once they become victims or plaintiffs, they don't typically always act in the way a average person is going to expect a victim or a plaintiff to act.
I see some of this stuff in some of these emails, one woman in particular, and I'm sure you know her name, where, I think she was a dental assistant or something that was going to be the woman who got his apartment or something. I mean, you see a lot of that kind of stuff. But is there everybody that is at the apartment or on the island, are they getting cash for that? Or is the lure just like, I used to joke, like somebody tells me, here's a plane to an island, it sounds pretty cool to me, right? If you're not really looking into who this guy is there always a transactional nature to it?
For the most part. But
financially
again,
transactional.
Yeah, so he would give cash to, especially early on. That was part of his MO. He would, the first thing he would do typically is always started with massages.
Yeah.
That was his thing. He enjoyed massages. He had recruiters, whether it was just Ghislaine Maxwell or he had other young women he would pay to recruit, other like sort of, destitute women who needed money. He would use them to go and recruit other women. Hey, I know this really rich guy. He's kind of weird, but he'll give you $300. All you got to do is come massage him. That's how he started. And then he would sort of get them, quote unquote, addicted to the money. That would become their only source of income. They would be down and out. Or again, it wasn't necessarily cash. It was modeling contracts. It was not terminating their visa, not terminating their job that would result in their visa being, eliminated. It was embarrassment. He would threaten women. That's another thing I think is underreported is he would truly like threaten death upon women, upon their families if they ever told people. I would say one of the more profound aspects.
Is there like written evidence of that?
I have, from my clients, I have evidence of it. Yeah. Now he would, threaten to say, if you ever tell anyone, I will kill your family. Like, look, this is me and world leader X. I will destroy your life. I will destroy your family. I would say that's some of the more profound emotional distress damages you see in my clients and a lot of his victims and survivors that was unreported. They assume it's just, of course, the terrible damages from the sex trafficking. But a lot of it is that they've lived in fear still for decades and decades of what Jeffrey Epstein or his circle will do. I've spoke to my clients who tell me they still, when they turn off their lights at night, see him in the window, right? See him outside. They've been haunted by Jeffrey Epstein, his circle, and what he might do to them even beyond the grave. And that's why so many of them have stayed anonymous.
Look, from a journalist perspective, you say Epstein survivors. I choose not to say that. And the reason I don't is I don't know who they are. I don't know this is just honestly, as a journalist, you want to be able to look at their claims and say, this seems right to me. Because there have been some claims that I've looked at and I thought sounded a bit nuts. Someone who said, very famous one who wrote a book, said she saw Jeffrey Epstein shapeshift into like a lizard. And it's like, oh, that doesn't, and again, one person doesn't nullify the fact that we know,
certainly,
particularly during that first trial, and particularly the fact that he pled guilty to it, in particular that you see him treat this in such a cavalier way when asked, for instance, as I mentioned, by Steve Bannon. But how do you... I'm asking this kind of as a journalist too. How does one judge the credibility when there is an Epstein victim fund and there are big banks that are part of this that pay out these settlements? And how does one adjudicate whether or not these people are telling the truth? I looked at some of these files and there was one email chain from someone, their name was redacted, in making claims that seemed completely implausible. How do you do that?
There's always going to be bad actors, right? And that's true for anyone. We saw in the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement was a great thing. It was an amazing thing for women empowerment and believing women. And then, you could say that there became false claims, and that sort of became sort of Me Too fatigue, and that it can ruin. A false claim. I am obviously, of course, 100% anti false claims of sexual assault and rape, and those can ruin a good movement, or and can take away from the credibility of women who are telling the truth. And the way, there's no special formula as to how you do it. A lot of it is vetting. We don't just say, as a lawyer, I represent women against very high profile individuals. I have to be extra careful. And I always, come with the approach of believing women.
People must be coming to you all the time.
We hear all the time, of course. And then unfortunately, we have to reject a lot of the cases that come to us that don't seem credible. And that's something we as lawyers, always have to do. But we go through a very strict vetting process. It always starts with believing women. I think there's exceptions, of course, but I think there's a misconception about how lucrative it can be to be a sexual abuse victim. You know, oh, they're just doing it for money. She's doing it for fame. That is a really terrible way to make money or to get famous, is to publicly accuse a powerful person of sexual assault.
If you're anonymous.
Yeah. Well, oh, sir. Okay. If you're anonymous, but for Epstein, who's someone who is dead, someone we know there's not going to be a trial, we have to, it's a vetting process. It's speaking to them. It's interviewing them. It's interviewing them in person. It's interviewing them multiple times. It's speaking to witnesses. Were there contemporaneous complaints is a great way you can look at it. You know, did you tell someone at the time? Is there someone we could speak to who will corroborate that, yeah, you left Jeffrey Epstein's house? Like, you're not going to believe what just happened to me. Is there therapy records? You know, there's a lot of ways.
And you're dealing in a time period, too, where it becomes a little more difficult.
Before email.
In the sense, before a lot of email, before text messages.
Before a lot of written communication was common.
I have someone yell at me in the subway, and 9 people know by the time I get home.
Exactly.
Right? There's contemporaneous, for like pretty much for anything that happens in my life.
Right.
But you're dealing with a time when that's not as common.
And also the story, right? I mean, we know it's also sort of easy sometimes to identify when someone is just picking things out of the news. They're sort of just, as someone who's been doing this for as long as I have, and basically only doing this for so long, you sort of get a sense of it, you know, and I don't, you know, it's not a superpower, but you sort of get a sense for when someone is being sincere and someone is telling the truth, the way they tell the story, the details they have, the details that just don't seem right, the details that are way too readily available, and those are the only details they have. So, you know, again, it's there's no, you know, quick answer. There's no specific formula. If they check off all these marks, they're telling the truth.
It must drive you crazy in your job and what you're doing. If you see people going on, you know, the Alex Jones show or something and making these outlandish claims as a victim of Jeffrey Epstein, I mean, that clearly makes life difficult for you, right?
Any false claim makes life difficult for me, but, you know, who cares about me? That makes life difficult for the victims. I mean, true victims, because every time there is a public false claim, it just undermines all the real claims coming forward, and it deters women from coming forward. If they see someone whose claim is disproven, that, oh my God, are they going to think that I'm lying? You know, oh my God, that they thought that woman was lying. Are they going to think that because I wrote this text message that means I wasn't abused and that means I wasn't telling the truth, or because I posted a picture of myself in a bathing suit on Instagram that means I wanted it, or something like that? You know, like those types of false claims undermine the ability and sort of disempower, that's a word, disempower women from coming forward. That's the last thing we want. We want women to be empowered. We want women to come forward and accuse these powerful.
I think one of the reasons I ask this question is, I mean, it's both a journalistic question and an interested question in the sense that there's one famous Jeffrey Epstein victim who was not called to trial during the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. And it has been reported that it was because of a credibility issue, of worries about her credibility. And that's Virginia Giuffre. Someone like that, who I think is probably the focus and the locus point of so many of the bigger conspiracy theories. You've read her book. You've gone through her testimony. This is probably in complementary to some of the testimony that comes from the people you represent. For the average person trying to figure out her credibility, I mean, she was forced to say that, no, I was not, you know, did not have sex or was sexually assaulted by Alan Dershowitz, for instance. Right. And I think one other person that might be, you can correct me on that. But what should people make of her?
I mean, my personal opinion, I think Virginia Giuffre is a hero. I think she should be remembered that way. And I think she did something that was very courageous and very difficult thing to do. And you look what her life became, you know, where she's been passed away, unfortunately, for quite some time. We're still talking about her. I was at a rally in Washington, D.C. on behalf of Epstein survivors, and there was some agitator, quote unquote, journalist, you know, trying
Michael Tracy, who I've had on the show. And I think that Michael is an interesting person because love him or hate him, I think that the good push and pull of a debate on this, Michael has been the one who's been reporting a lot of this stuff. And I give you the chance to say that he's wrong about something or whatever it is. But
I don't know his intentions. I just remember that remember one person. That was like the first time. I don't think I'd realized that there was that amount of pushback against Virginia Giuffre and her claims.
I think the reason I'm asking is because there's not.
Right.
And Michael has said this, and I've seen him out there talking about it. So I asked him about it, and I had him come on the show to discuss it. And I'm wondering, like, when you see those claims from him, I'm not a partisan on this issue. I've I think there's some things he brings up that say, well, that's kind of odd, and she's changed stories on a number of things over time.
Yeah.
So what is your counter to him on that issue?
Sure, and it's difficult to get into the nuances of Virginia Giuffre, but generally, I could say, women or victims typically don't live their life as if they're going to be a victim, as if they're going to be a plaintiff, as if they're going to be a witness in a lawsuit for themselves. And typically, once they become witnesses or once they become victims or plaintiffs, they don't typically always act in the way a average person is going to expect a victim or a plaintiff to act. You often see, and in my line of work, you often see text messages like, why did you write that text? Why did you write that? People I 100% believe sometimes do stupid things that can undermine their allegations. Again, this isn't specific to Virginia Giuffre, but there's a phenomenon called fawning, where a sex abuse victim will sort of praise and almost be kind to their abuser, their rapist, because it's almost a subconscious way of pretending that the abuse didn't happen. It's almost
But when is it not that, and how do you decide?
And that's for the judge, or for the jury, to decide. And there's always nuances here, and there's always ways.
But how do you decide that?
It's a very good question. It's based on, it's more, what evidence is there? I mean, there's always, is there evidence talking to them? There's a lot of factors that come into play. And I'm not trying to avoid the question by just saying there's a lot of factors, because there's no right answer. There's no right, well, if they answer this question right, that means they're telling the truth. If they answer it wrong, they're lying. It's just a lot that goes into it. And I don't like to use this word, but there's, a lot of just like feeling it out and vibes, if you will. Like, there's a lot to just using my own sense and my own common sense and looking at the evidence and speaking to the victim. But I guess the larger answer is, as it relates to Virginia Giuffre and other victims who are questioned, is that like they're not perfect. They're all people. We all make mistakes in basically everything we do. I've probably told thousands of stories that I've gotten wrong a few times. And often sometimes telling a story, getting it wrong a few times, getting details incorrect, most experts will say is an indication of telling the truth. That if someone goes up there and they tell the exact same story 100 times in a row and it's every detail and every nuance is the exact same, that's actually indicative of maybe they're making it up. So again, there's so much to look at when it comes to believing women or prosecuting.
But to get something wrong in, say, that you were raped by Alan Dershowitz is not a small thing. That's
not a small thing. Now remember, that was my understanding, part of some sort of settlement or some sort of resolution to the case. I don't know the details of it. And often, and again, I'm certainly not saying Alan Dershowitz did anything of the sort, but you never know what goes into, because a victim says something as a result or at the end of a lawsuit against a certain person, that does not necessarily mean that that's exactly what happened. Could be part of a settlement.
Before.
Or exactly. Could be part of a settlement deal, could be part of a resolution, and this is a little, inside baseball here, but every single settlement agreement is the defendant is going to say the defendant has no admission of wrongdoing or anything like that, and all parties agree that there's no admission of wrongdoing. If someone would get a hold of that settlement agreement, they look, she got money, and then the defendant didn't even acknowledge he did something wrong, they would use that as, look, no, he did nothing wrong and she signed it. Right. So there's a lot, there's so much that goes into these stories and so much that goes into decisions to say something. Again, I have no idea what happened with Ms.
Yeah, I didn't read her book either.
Alan Dershowitz, and I would not know, and only they know. But I guess the important part is women are not, and victims are not perfect robots of being a victim, and they are going to say things, they are going to testify wrong sometimes, they're going to say something that they probably thought helped their case and it hurts their case. They're probably going to have a text message where they joked about something to their girlfriend because they're trying to compensate for it, and they responded ha 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 and they respond to a rape joke. Or they're going to send a text message to their rapist and they're going to say, had fun last night or something, as a means of convincing themselves that it wasn't rape and they were just really drunk and they're just regretting it. There's all sorts of things we see in my line of work that victims do that are not perfect, that to a jury might say, listen, I don't believe that person, but it doesn't mean they're not victims. Just means that they sometimes are not doing everything that a jury or a skeptic would expect a victim of sexual assault to do.